Please join me in giving Secretary Shawn Sullivan a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. It's great to be here with you all this afternoon. I do want to note that I think this is the first time in many years that my parents have heard me speak. So that almost makes me nervous. So, my mother is a Wichita native, graduate of Wichita South, St. Francis School of Nursing, was a nurse here in Wichita for several years. My father grew up in the huge big town of Douglas, Kansas, and went to Butler County, Pittsburgh State, and then worked here several places at Coleman, Boeing, retired from Spirit. I do want to say, to try to add to my bona fides for Son of the Year, that my father turned 70 years old yesterday. So let's give my dad a hand for making it that far with very shady kids. I just want to cover a few things this afternoon, then I'll make sure I leave time at the end for questions. First, the buzzword of fake news goes around these days. Talk about a little bit of fake news. Second, talk about spending at the state level. Third, talk about the governor's proposals and things he's put out. And then fourth, some alternatives that have been thrown around. So the first bit of fake news is 2012 tax cuts from the Governor Brownback aren't working. I know he has addressed this to you all as a club a couple times. He's been here over the last couple of years, most recently, I believe last August or September. But if you read most things, hear most people, hear most legislators, you will hear that these tax cuts that he passed a couple years ago are and have been a huge disaster, particularly around their resulting effect to the state budget, taxes, revenue, jobs, etc. What's actually happened was that we've had 6 years of record business formations. 82% of all new job creation in the state of Kansas has been through the entities that have received the exemption. We reversed 20 years of cumulative wealth loss to Missouri. And lastly, we've had 37 consecutive months, actually more than that, this is a dated presentation, of unemployment below 5%. There was a new job report that came out this morning that actually was very positive, that lowered our unemployment rate to 4.1%. That number two said that in 2016 we had the record number of private sector jobs ever in the state of Kansas, among other positive news. So I think things, despite some of the challenges we've had the last few years with the agriculture and energy sectors, are starting to turn around. The two things that we hear the most as to why these have been a disaster have been, well, they haven't created jobs, and number two, hasn't created the revenue to sustain the state budget, or we've lost revenue. And both of those things are not true. First, on job growth, we have struggled with job growth, but we've also struggled with that because of a global commodity challenges, again, around agriculture and energy, as the governor told you last time he was here. When you segregate out job growth, the ones that are growing are the businesses that benefited from this tax cut. So we believe that if this wouldn't have been done, that things and the growth both have been much worse over the last couple of years. And the second, with revenue, no, it's not creating enough revenue for a lot of what people want in Kansas that use government taxpayer money, but it is still creating more revenue every year, year over year, and we're starting to come out from some of the challenges again that we've had the last couple months. So I wanted to hit on that. The main challenge that we've had has been just lack of revenue growth. So we've had more revenue every year, but it hasn't grown at the rate that it traditionally has. On the slide, you'll see what the tax collections were going back 3 years to fiscal year 2014. It was $5.632 billion. And then what they're projected to be this year, which is $5.683 billion. That's a growth of about $50 million and only a growth rate of 0.3%. If you compare that to the growth rate of tax collections, receipts coming in the state of the previous 25 years, it's about 12 times less growth than what we normally see. The problem with blaming that on the tax cuts is the tax cuts were already in place. They were already baked in the cake by 2014. So how could the tax cuts have caused the anemic job growth unless you believe tax cuts lead to weakened economy, less job growth, et cetera? So this has not been, tax cuts have not been the cause of anemic growth of state revenues. This provides a visual of what we normally get, 3.5% growth a year in tax collections versus 0.3 the last 3 years. Again, 12 times less growth. If we would have been able to receive the normal growth rate of 3.5% the last couple of years, plus other changes that have been made, we would have $900 million more this year in the state coffers than what we will actually have. And we wouldn't be talking about a lot of the budget challenges. Actually, we would be talking about them because we would have spent a lot more money. But we wouldn't have a lot of the same challenges that we have and are talked about now. So what has caused that 0.3% growth? And it's something that I don't believe is discussed enough, and that primarily has been the energy and agricultural sector challenges. So here's some information on agricultural. We've had a significant drop in prices with corn, soybeans, wheat, livestock, cattle over the last couple of years, which has had a significant effect on the economy. Net farm income was very high back in 2013. And then in 2015, went from a net farm income in Kansas of $128,000 to average of almost $4,500, a little over $4,500. And then for 2016, it's expected to be even less than that, despite huge production levels and great harvests that we had last year with great weather. So I was somewhat skeptical even last year of the effect that the agricultural sector had on state tax receipts in our economy. And the reason I was skeptical was, most of what farmers and ranchers buy with combines and other farm equipment is sales tax exempt. So what effect does it really have on it anyway? It is sales tax exempt, but it has a huge spillover effect into the Main Street purchasing power, particularly in the 70, 80, 85 counties where agriculture is the primary sector that they rely on. This is a chart that comes from the Kansas City Federal Reserve, which has 4 or 5 states like Kansas in it, and it tracks on an index and surveys that they do of farm income, capital spending, household spending, and you'll see a significant decrease starting in 14, 15, 16, and 17. Household spending and capital spending track with the farm income. We also had a model done from Kansas State along with our Department of Agriculture at the state level that showed us that for every 1% decrease in agricultural farm commodities, there's a corresponding $7.8 million decrease in tax receipts. So that alone, just on sales tax receipts, that alone to our sales tax collections has had an effect of it's somewhere between $150 to $200 million less just from that agricultural challenge. The second thing besides this is this happening in other states? And I would say, yes, it is, particularly in the plains and Midwest areas because of the agriculture, energy sector, prices of oil and gas, et cetera. Just looking at our surrounding states, Oklahoma has a $900 million shortfall that they're dealing with. Nebraska has a $900 million shortfall that they're dealing with. Missouri has somewhere between $400 to $500 million shortfall they are dealing with. Colorado doesn't report much like the other states do, but they also have a shortfall. Can we also blame that on the Brownback tax cuts for those states? I'm not sure that we can. And on the slide, you'll see other information that we get from national groups and reports that over half the states had similar revenue challenges that we had last year as far as lack of growth in revenue. Almost 19 states reported reductions in their budget in 16 like we did. Almost half the states just this year, what we call our fiscal year 2017, have had revenue shortfalls even though we have started to come out of that. going to park here for a few minutes. So that's the revenue side. Again, our primary challenge, because of those economic challenges and sector challenges, we've had 0.3% growth, about 12 times less growth than what we normally do going back 25 years. On the spending side, which gets to the root of why a lot of people are upset about Topeka and about this administration with this governor, is government has not grown like it traditionally has. This chart goes back to Governor Docking, Bennett, Carlin, Hayden, Finney, Graves, Sebelius, Parkinson, and you'll see the average growth of our general fund, state government, every year. I think I showed this about a year and a half when I was here. And you'll see anywhere from almost 13% growth to where you get to less than that because of the dot-com recession with Graves and the Great Recession with Sebelius, Parkinson. But on average, between all those administrations, it has grown about 9% a year. Compare that to what we've had with Governor Brownback from 2012, his first full budget, to what he proposed for the last year of his term has been an average of 1% growth. And to me, that gets to the root of why there's a lot of acrimony, negative headlines, editorial writings, about what the governor has done. My history is, as John said earlier, was in long-term care administration, including in some places that were very rural and small nursing homes that I led throughout my career before I came to Topeka. In those places you had very tight operating margins, you had to manage your expenses very closely, and I had to know how much chicken was in the chicken and noodle soup. So I always assumed that I paid attention to politics and the government, but not a whole lot to the state fiscal situation. Assumed that was the way it was done within state. I knew it wasn't a federal government, but assumed it was done that way in local and state government. And what I found when I came in Topeka in 2011 was that wasn't the case. So why wasn't it? I want to point to 5 or 6 reasons as I kind of park here for a minute before I move on to the current situation as to why you've seen these trends and why it's been very difficult to bend the cost curve of government and to curb spending growth. The first is resistance from agencies, resistance from staff, resistance from legislators, kind of number one. When I started in 2011 at the Department of Aging, which became the Department for Aging and Disability Services a couple years later, my first week or two that I was in Topeka, I started in January 2011. I got a call and said the previous administration and this agency overspent what they had been given with the appropriations and budget. We're going to have to start a waiting list for services for these programs, and gave me a specific number for what we were short. Over the next month or two, I worked with stakeholders and staff to address that. We put together a plan so we wouldn't have to have a waiting list. Instead, would make reductions other places. We cut staff, we had layoffs in order to prevent cuts in services or waiting lists for those services. When I was going out and selling that plan, which had several different aspects to it, particularly to legislative committees, they looked at me like I was an alien because I wasn't going in front of their budget committees and just asking for more money. It's just not something that is natural in government. And the reason for that is it's much easier just to go and ask for more money and say, here's what the spending is, here's what it's gone to, and if we don't do this, then we're going to have to cut senior programs, cut kids programs, on and on, instead of taking a look at how things can change, how we can streamline things, how we can combine responsibilities, departments, and those things. So the first is resistance from agencies. The second is, for a lot of issues, legislators want to be reelected. They don't like it when locals are upset, and locals become upset when there are significant changes that are made. So another example of this, going back to my former agency life, was if you do bulk purchasing, say for agencies or state hospital, you're able to leverage more volume to lower prices. So we tried that with a couple of our state hospitals that we ran, and outsource the food services operation so we could have greater purchasing power for the raw food that we were buying. We ended up saving about $1.5 million by doing that. Really no changes to services. If not, it was better. Really no changes to the staff. But just from that small change, the local legislators became upset because the locals didn't want that change for a number of reasons, and then you get pulled into many meetings and other things. Another example is Department of Revenue 2 years ago at the state level recommended changing the way that we do vehicle registration renewals. Instead of sending long forms, to send a postcard reminder out to constituents that save a little over $500,000. They took that to budget committees and other legislators and said, here's an idea, as we're looking for ways to streamline government, become more efficient, save money. Here's what we can do in this regard. A lot of the counties became upset about that. County treasurer's office that deal with that became upset. Instead of implementing that, what legislators did was they put a proviso in a tax bill that said Department of Revenue can't go do that, and they built on top of that and took the money and did some other things. So that's an example of locals becoming upset when you try to make change. Another example is we have dozens and dozens and dozens of little fee-funded boards and commissions that regulate licensed industries and professionals. First, I'd question whether we really need those things. Second, whether we need to have a credit union, a banking commission, a board of barbering, a board of cosmetology. There's 10 different examples I could give, but what happens every time you propose a change in those structures is that licensing group becomes unhinged. They come up and lobby because they don't want to make that change, and then legislators become fearful of that change and don't want to make it. So one, resistance from agencies. Two, locals become upset, lobby legislators. Three, it's just easier not to change and to go back every year and ask for more money. Could give a lot of examples of that. Four, special interest groups, and a lot of them you wouldn't normally think of in that regard. But we'll say, make this change, or you can't do that because we're doing this for the kids, or can't cut those programs for babies. Roads are going to be in a state of disrepair, whatever it may be. I think KDOT's a great example of that. Last year we spent more money in expenditures. We spent more money, had higher expenditures than ever before in fiscal year 2016. Not ever before, but more than the last several years. And yet there was a lot of hue and cry, particularly around the election cycle, about the roads falling into disrepair. We were stealing hundreds of millions from KDOT to send it over to the state general fund and transfer to subsidize the budget, on and on and on. Instead of looking at what we actually need to spend, tying metrics of that, what our roads need to be for repair, overlay, maintenance, preservation, all the conversation becomes around what were we promised back in 2009 and 10, and what do we have now compared to that. And the special interest groups spend a lot of money to do that, and in a lot of respects are very successful in doing that. Number five, it's someone else's money. Example I give on this one is capital improvements, or what we call bond and interest aid for K-12 and schools. I've lived in several districts around the state before I went to Topeka where there have been large bond issues where they give citizens buttons and say, we've got to pass this because the state's talking about changing this formula for how bond issues are paid for, and right now they'll pay 30% of the cost. When we passed the block grants a couple years ago, there was a change in that and how those bond issues were funded and the match that the state paid for it. And when that happened, there were 15 bond issues that were proposed in May and June of 2015, right after that legislation passed, and 14 of those 15 passed their local constituent group, and cost the state a lot more money than what we're paying. We've almost doubled from $100 to $200 million what we're paying for local facilities and bond issues around the state. My experience over the last couple of years, my kids go to a small private Christian school in Topeka. I happen to be the treasurer of the board of that school. Our enrollment has grown 10% a year the last couple of years, where we're now gone from 290 to 350 students in this K-12 school, and we've run out of room. Our classes are meeting in cafeteria and other places. Instead of our ability to go and ask the state to pay a certain percentage for a $10 million new building to add the classrooms we need, we're forced to be creative. We're forced to go and look at other alternatives, and what we're going to do is this summer add 7 classrooms to our attic at a cost of $1.5 million. But compare that to what happens, I think what you all see as well, even in Wichita or other places, and it's not happening, I think, because it's someone else's money and someone else is paying for it. And then lastly, we have examples where it's kind of a combination of all those things. We have 286 school districts. There's been a lot of discussion about the number and the level and the type of administrative and staffing at schools. I think there's a couple of very simple changes that could be made to save a lot of money, and particularly as a new school finance formula is discussed and passed over the next couple of months. One of those changes is bulk purchasing of IT, food, fuel, some utilities, but instead of having those conversations and having constructive conversations, what we always end up talking about is why we can't do it. We can't take that out of the local economy. We can't do it for these 10 reasons, instead of how we can have conversations about how to make those changes to have less cost. Another is health benefits at schools. Something that the governor proposed in his budget would save around $70 to $80 million a year. Instead of having 280 plans, different plans for 286 school districts for health plans of staff and 70,000 teachers and staff, having one pool with several different options that they can choose from and be able to save the administrative cost of that. Those of you who are familiar with the insurance industry, you pay a lot more as a plan if you're small, if you don't have volume to leverage lower cost, and if you're paying for the risk of that. Instead of having those conversations constructively about how we can come together to do that, what we do instead is we talk about how it's coming out of the local economy, can't do that to the kids, can't do it to the teachers, it's someone else's money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just continues to be frustrating. I'll leave this and move on, but I will contend, if you remember last fall during the election cycle, there were 4 governors, Carlin, Hayden, Sebelius, and Graves, that had a lot of different public events to bash conservative candidates and also the governor. I'll go back to what I said about 5 minutes ago. I think the root of that is government is not growing like they wanted it to. To me, that's a good thing. To get into more specific numbers, you look at where we've gone from where we are now. So go back 11 years, 12 years, 2005, the state was spending $4.69 billion within our general fund within state government. Then there was a huge run up in spending, particularly on K-12 schools, and we went from $4.6 billion to $6.1 billion over the course of those 3 years, to where in fiscal 2008 we were spending what you see on the screen. Then the recession hit and went down. A lot of federal stimulus money was put in the state budget. 2012, by that time, had gone down and back up, and that federal money had been replaced. We were spending a little less than $6.1 billion. The next 4 years went up and down again, to where last year we ended the year with $6.115 billion, which was just $17 million than the governor's first, $17 million more than the governor's first budget in 2012. And then what he proposed for the next couple of years is the last one on the screen there, not yet adopted, but proposed, of a little over $6.15 billion. which would be just a little over $50 billion of growth since his first budget. So you compare where he's come from to, say, 2008 or 12, it's fairly flat. And if you dig into that more, the challenges that we really have with the state budget are, okay, here's a flat growth within the general fund. You have certain things with entitlement funding, Medicaid, schools, that make it go like this automatically. Then you have to try to pare it down and create efficiencies and policy savings within Medicaid and do some other things to get it back down to where you're closer to where you need to be. And that's what we've tried to do, but it still has not been a decrease in spending, or still has not been enough to correspond with the 0.3% growth in revenue that we've had. The next two slides just give a general overview of how money comes in and goes out of that general fund. We get about $6 billion a year of tax collections coming in, and 41% of that comes from our sales and use taxes. 37% of every dollar is from our individual income tax, and then everything else is a much smaller category. For every dollar that goes out that we spend, 60.9% is spent on education. Of that, half of the state budget, 50%, goes to K-12, to our 286 school districts. And another 12 or 13%, 12% goes to higher ed, to universities, colleges, tech, etc. That particular part of the pie has grown by 8 to 10%, depending on what baseline year you use, but has grown by 8 to 10% since 2012. The second largest budget item is human services, of which most of, if not all of that, is Medicaid, the 425,000 people we serve through that program. We've made huge changes to that program. We've had 25% increase in caseloads. A lot of that's attributable to Obamacare, woodwork effect, as we call it. We've significantly reduced the growth of the program, of the costs, but it's still grown because of the number of people we've had on it, which has created huge challenges with the budget. We'll see what happens at the federal level over the next year through the Obamacare replacement proposal of Speaker Ryan and or others as that moves through the process the next month or two. I think most plans that we've seen and heard about will give us as states much more flexibility to manage our costs, manage outcomes, manage the program than what we've had in the past. What was in the Speaker Ryan's plan that was outlined earlier this week were per capita Medicaid block grants, to where we get certain dollar amount per capita, and then we'd have much more flexibility on how to manage that program. And then the rest of the state budget, once you get past education and human services, that's 88% of the budget. Everything else is the remaining 12% and much smaller. And we pared down, again, quite a bit over the last couple of years to the tune of 8 to 10% reductions. What we have tried to do with our budget proposals have been, number one, protect core services. That's been a challenge with 0.3% revenue growth coming in because of the economic challenges, but still tried to do that. Number two, gain additional efficiencies. We've worked very heavily on efficiency study the legislature completed last year. Continue to work on a lot of those things. Three, lessen reliance on one-time fixes and have structural balance by the second year of the upcoming budget cycle. And then three, have growing margins where we're not operating on such a tight margin as we are now. So what we propose for the fiscal year that started in 2018, I'm going to run through that real quick. It didn't get hasn't not received a lot of serious consideration really in the House or the Senate, a lot of the different aspects of this proposal. We're currently in fiscal year 17. I think most people are in agreement with what will have to happen this year to address the shortfall. Once we get into next year is a different situation or challenge. So there's a number of different ways that we could calculate what the quote-unquote shortfall is for the state budget. When I do it, it's around a little over $515 million for the fiscal year that starts July 1. So here's how we addressed it. Number one, we plugged into our budget almost $50 million of efficiencies for schools, for bulk purchasing, health benefit consolidation. That would double in year 2 as you have a full year of those implementation. We had a number of Medicaid policy changes and efficiencies built in that would save us $34 million. Instead of passing on and holding the judicial system branch budget increase that they requested, if you hold it flat, it saves $22 million. The next two things are changes within our CAPER system, which is we are now facing having to pay for significant sins of the past, going back to 1993. We've averaged $350 million a year that we put in from the state to our CAPER's pension system, which is about $150 million more a year we are putting in than Sebelius or Parkinson did. But even with that $1 billion more we put in of contributions, the contribution levels are set to significantly increase over the next couple of years. So instead of paying $350, if we stay with current law or baseline, we'd be paying $670 million by 2020, $800 million by 2025, $900 million by 2030, $1 billion by 2034, and then back to about $140 million once the past sins are paid off. So we propose to slow that down and extend the payback period. Even if we don't do that, and it hasn't been given serious consideration or much discussion this session, it's an issue that will have to be revisited. They went and lowered the rate of return of investment portfolio at the CAPERS level, and that will just force the issue more. But we had a couple of proposals there. And then the governor's tax increases were $180 million, and then also non-recurring one-time fixes of $16 million to lead to about a 3.5% ending balance or surplus of $238 million. Okay, so you start with that. That was the governor's proposal. Here's what happens with kind of holding those budget assumptions the same. They will change. The legislature will end up spending more than what we proposed. But a lot of the discussion in the last few weeks has been what will happen if the huge $590 million tax increase that was passed that the governor vetoed. Okay, what would the budget look like if that was inserted? And what have they been talking about? So here's what the governor proposed. Number one, take away the K-12 efficiencies. Those will not end up in the budget of the legislatures. Number two, take out the CAPERS changes, some of those. Number three, take out his tax proposal, his one-time fix. Take out that ending balance in, and the shortfall you're left with is $340 million. Add a $590 million retroactive tax increase that raises rates on income tax rates, and also restores the LLC small business loophole that's not really a loophole, and add that money to the coffers, and then you get $246 million ending balance for next fiscal year. So that passed, received applause actually in the House of Representatives when it passed, which was surprising. The Senate voted for it, the governor vetoed it, House overrode the veto. The Senate came up 3 votes short. They needed 27 votes to override the veto. They were able to get 24 votes. Most of what's been discussed since then has been, okay, well, we can get 27 votes in the Senate if we take out the retroactivity part to that tax bill for 2178. So we're still going to increase the rates significantly. We're still going to get rid of the small business exemption, but we'll take out the retroactivity and make the rates at least effective next January. So let's start with that $246 million ending balance reserves from the previous plan for if they were to be able to override and have the $590 million tax increase. Take that out. You go from $590 million of tax increase of $300 million, and you're back below zero with ending balance of negative 44. So that would obviously still leave a lot of work for them to do. The thing is, though, this doesn't address a lot of things that a lot of people campaigned on or have talked about. So I want to cover those real quick. So let's take what was that huge tax increase of $590 million, retro tax increase, and the reserves it would create of about $246 million. Again, that's going to go up or down how they eventually pass the budget they pass. They would have to add $288 million to do what they want to do of restoring the state general fund transfers to the highway fund, even though I would say and submit that doesn't need to be done. $115 million to pay back capers. Another thing that floored me was right after the tax increase, the House went and passed by almost veto-proof majority to expand Medicaid. At the exact same time, the feds are talking about rolling it back. And the Speaker Ryan plan would roll significant portions of the Medicaid expansion back and take, instead of where the feds are paying for 90% of it, starting in 2020, new enrollees will go at the normal percentage that the feds pay, which is 57%. But yet, they still were able to pass it. And I think it would get past the Senate, probably close to veto-proof majority votes, if and when they take it up here in the next month or so, which just seems absolutely crazy to me. But it would have a $27 million cost in the first year, go to about $60, $70 million in year two, be about $1 billion of additional costs over the next 10 years. I don't think it costs this much, but what most people up in Topeka are talking about to meet the Supreme Court Gannon adequacy decision are having to add somewhere between $535 to $900 million. So you can add that on top too. Again, I'm not advocating for that needing to happen, but that is what a lot of people are talking about. You add all those things up, and you go from 246 million reserves to something much less than that. So to end with, here are kind of the remaining questions for the next couple months. First, with schools, what will happen with the efficiencies that the governor proposed that we think is good policy? Number two, what will this new school finance system look like? Does it make any substantial, significant reforms? It should. Now is the time to make sure we have the options for school choice in a school finance formula. What effect does the Supreme Court decision have on that system? Number two, with Medicaid, will the efficiency proposals that we submitted be enacted and in the budget? And then largely what will happen with the expansion that passed, will expansion pass the Senate like it did the House? With capers, will there be any policy changes? With the highway fund, will the transfers to the state general fund continue? Will a gas tax be passed? There's been already one of anywhere from 5 cent to 12 cent increase to motor fuel gas tax been proposed. There'll be a lot of discussion about that over the next couple of weeks, so hold on to your wallets. For taxes, will a bill similar to what passed the Senate and the House pass again? Will they keep sending that to the governor? Will they get veto-proof majority? Will they take that out, the retroactivity part out, to get veto-proof majority? Will other alternatives emerge? Speaking somewhat of fake news again, I get frustrated by people saying the governor has not proposed other alternatives. He has. He does on a weekly basis with both House and Senate leadership. Even this last Monday, he proposed to them and worked through them with them what some alternative tax and budget proposals could be. And then on Tuesday, they went and proposed and took up a fake debate of the governor's tax package on the Senate floor and stood up and said that he had not submitted any alternatives, which he has. But they're going to use that to justify voting for significant tax increases, is my prediction. And then also on the revenue side, will the recent growth we've had in tax collections the last 3 or 4 months continue? I think we are seeing the economy hopefully starting to turn around. I think we're seeing a Trump bump in that with more certainty of it. I think that affects our tax collections. For the first time in about a year, we've seen increases compared to the previous year in our sales tax collections, Our payroll withholdings that we get from our income taxes have been strong, and particularly over the last couple of months, so hopefully that will continue. So that is kind of where we are and what we'll be looking at and talking about over the next, between now and May or June with both the Senate and the House. Let me end by saying this, that, I don't get a lot of time to spend by myself, either I'm at work or at home with four small kids and driving around Topeka. So I was grateful for a couple hours in the car this morning. And a little bit off the topic of budget and taxes, there are a lot of things about Topeka, about state government, about politics that drive me crazy and drive me nuts. One of them is just the vitriolic nature of how we talk. Normal people do not talk the way that we talk in politics, even in Topeka. And then also the nature of very personal attacks, questioning people's motives, are also not, I think, how Kansans talk, but we do in Topeka. There's a lot of people that have said a lot of things about Governor Sam Brownback over the last 6 years. I think a lot of that goes to a lot of his positions, which I think are good, on social issues with abortion, Second Amendment, etc. We've seen a lot of that ratchet up over the last couple of weeks, particularly with this veto override, and a lot of the things that have been written and said this week with rumors of him going to work for the Trump administration. But I do want to say there is no better man that I've worked for, no better man that I've met, no man that has a better interest of Kansas for what he is trying to do than Sam Brownback. And one last thing, I'm grateful to work for a man that is willing to stand up for the right thing, what he believes are the right things, despite what things are said or written about him, because he's doing that and intending to do it by protecting taxpayers and protecting the state of Kansas. So I'm glad to work for a man that's willing to do that, stand up for what he feels is right, even though he takes an enormous amount of heat for it. So I'm proud to work for him, and I'm proud to live in a state where he is governor. So with that, I'll wrap up and see if you guys have any questions.
I'll work around the room. There'll be lots of questions. I'll try to get there as quickly as I can. This microphone's really hot, so when you get it, hold it down a bit.
Yeah, my question is, as a non-lawyer who doesn't have a lot of respect for the court, how can the court enforce increased spending? The legislature makes the spending. Can the court force them to spend more money?
Depends on who you ask. There was a lot of debate about that last spring and summer when they issued their opinion on the so-called equity case last May, I think it was, April, May. And then we called a special session and legislators came back at the end of June. At that time, with that decision, the Supreme Court threatened to shut down the schools if there was not an equity remedy in place by July 1. A lot of legislators and the governor pointed back to a 2005 law that was passed 10 years ago that said the courts cannot shut down schools related to a finance decision. But ultimately, a lot of people believe the Supreme Court can do what the Supreme Court wants to do. What happens with this? I mean, we have a whole different makeup in the legislature than we did last year. So we'll see what happens there as we go through the school finance discussions over the next couple months.
The fire disaster on grassland ranchers, it's awesome. Maybe too early to comment, but do they typically have really good insurance to cover that, or how will the state get involved with this loss?
Those have been horrific wildfires. I mean, Clark County in particular, where Ashland is, 85% of the county has been burned. The governor has been down in Hutchinson, Clark County, last 2 or 3 days working with local emergency officials. Spent a lot of time down there talking to different people. So it is, our chief counsel in the governor's office, Brant Lau, is a rancher by trade, also an attorney that works for us. His parents and family have a ranch in Washington County, north central Kansas. He went down with the governor yesterday and came back this morning as we were sitting in a staff meeting before I drove down here. He was recounting just the horrific things that he saw that he's never seen before in his time of being a rancher and raising cattle and livestock. Ranchers were literally going around and having to euthanize the livestock that had been burned or maimed or had whatever else going on, and just a horrific situation. But to answer your question, it's a mix of things. A lot of them do have insurance. There's a lot of federal programs that'll step in. Our involvement with money at the state level is rather limited, except for disaster relief programs and grants that we have some money for, that we budget on an annual basis, and that we provide to locals through our National Guard. So it really just depends on the situation.
Yes, with regard to capers, obviously some of the pain we're feeling now is self-induced pain. Do we have a plan in place to keep, let's say that we have a Republican administration, we bring capers back where it should be and we're all paid up and even, what's to stop a future administration that is of an irresponsible nature from putting us right back in the same position of spending money we don't have, borrowing it from capers, and here we'd be right in the same position again? Maybe there's some legislation needed.
It's going to take us between now and 2033 to pay off, again, the sins of the past of grossly underfunding capers. I think that needs to be extended because of challenges that we have. Again, huge increase that we're going to have to pay for that. But there's really, to answer your question, nothing that would stop a governor or legislature from changing that policy by legislation or what they're funding. Really, this all comes from a genesis of 1993. The legislature at that time added to the benefits of the caper system without paying for it. And since then, we have not paid for it.
Yeah, I would like to know how much revenue the state gets from the 2 casinos and the lottery, and where does that money go?
You're testing my memory. There's 2 or 3 different things we get. The first is lottery money from the original legislation going back to 1987, I think, called the Economic Development Incentive Fund, or EDI for short. A lot of that goes to economic development programs of the Department of Commerce. They are block granted money to pay for essentially their agency operations. There's also a block of that goes to our Wildlife and Parks Department to pay for a lot of what they do within operations. The expanded gaming legislation that passed in 2005 that now has Western Kansas, Mulvane, third casino, and another casino going down to Southeast Kansas. It goes to a variety of things. It goes to pay off our pension system. A chunk of it goes to pay off our pension system liability that we have. A chunk of it goes into our general fund to pay for all state agencies and programs. So it goes to a number of things. If you want specific numbers on that, I'd be happy to give it to you if you give me your information afterwards.
It's my understanding that the tax bill that the governor vetoed had in it the elimination of the March to zero. Is that coming back, or is the legislature trying to get that lid eliminated?
So the March to zero was put in place a couple years ago. After the 2012 tax cuts, where 3 tax brackets went to 2, the top bracket was 6.45. It's now 4.6, and then the bottom bracket is now 2.7. There were automatic rate reductions that took place on January 1 of 13 and 14. And then from there, the tax cut law said, starting in 2020, I think it is, any revenue that comes in greater than 102% of the previous year will go down to being used as buying down the rates further to get 4.6 and 2.7 lower than that to eventually you're to zero. House Bill 2147, which passed in the House and Senate, that the governor vetoed, got rid of that language, so there would be no future income tax rate reductions if that were to pass. I think I'm fairly safe in assuming that as they take up subsequent versions of that tax bill, take the retroactivity out that I talked about earlier, that it will include that getting rid of the March to zero. So we'll see what happens, and you never know what's going to end up being in or being out of legislation, but at this point, that seems to be a particular provision that the majority of the legislature is intent on eliminating.
Over here, this probably will be our last question.
I first would like to compliment you and the governor on having the ability or the fortitude to stand up, which is most difficult in situations where you get along, go along, which politics tends to be that way. Combination policy, philosophical comment on your part as to what you would like to see to drain the swamp, to use a Trump term, at the state level. Any specifics that say, obviously the Pachyderm does a good effort of getting people in like you to speak that's helpful, but specifically, do you have anything advice for all of us in general?
I think state government's a lot different than federal government. And we have reduced the number of employees that we've had at the state level by, I think, almost 4,000 over the last couple of years. We've outsourced a number of things. We need to continue looking at that, and we are. The legislative efficiency study that passed last year, done by a company called Alvarez and Marsal, or A&M for short, had a number of recommendations that we have been working on since then to go to joint procurement, bulk procurement within state agencies, go to a new fleet management system that's more efficient, leasing operations, how we do buildings, how we do property and casualty, insurance, risk management. So there's kind of 8 or 10 large measures that we have been working on that run counter to how state government has always been run. I think on our part, within the administration and leadership, what we can do is do those as fast as we can and do them as well as we can, so we're doing them well and not making huge changes like that, which they are, and having them not work. But the other part is to make sure we have the right leadership in place within our agencies. I think for the most part we have that. Many of you are familiar with Sam Williams here in Wichita, that ran for mayor a couple of years ago, was the managing partner at Sullivan, Higdon, and Sink for many, many years. We were very blessed to be able to get him to come into the Department of Revenue starting last December. He's doing an absolutely fantastic job. He and I work very closely together on a number of things, and he's working very diligently to reform the Department of Revenue, as an example, to reform their agency, to enhance some efficiencies, move some things around, and making sure that he and their agency is giving the optimal level of customer service for all the things that they do, from driver's licenses to DMVs to taxpayer assistance to collections and all those. So we'll continue to look at those two main things.
John Todd has one last question.
We see cities love to use the Star Bonds program for brand new retail and whatnot, and we watch how Town East, Town West particularly is struggling. Last December, you said it was $63.6 million that was flowing. You want to comment on that, please?
So those of you who are not familiar, Star Bonds was passed how many years ago? 15 or 20? It allows development districts to be able to bond or get financing and then use the sales tax revenue, future sales tax revenue from that retail development to pay off the debt service of that Star Bond district. The first one that was done was what we call Village West in Wyandotte County, or KCK. That's where the Legends is, the Speedway is, Great Wolf Lodge, a lot of those large retailers, Nebraska Furniture Mart. Those were 20-year bonds that they were able to do that on and develop that area. My own personal opinion is if Star Bonds should be done, they should be done in places like that where it's a regional attraction and you are not robbing Peter to pay Paul or taking away retail from Johnson County that's just moving up to a different area in Wyandotte County. Where I think it becomes questionable is when you're approving it for some of the things that have been done here in Wichita or other places around the state where you're enacting and creating a star bond district, you're putting retail businesses there. It's not new sales tax revenue that's coming into the state. All it is it's sales tax revenue that's being taken from somewhere else where we were getting tax collections, and it's moved to that sales tax exempt star bond district. So that's something that's received a lot of scrutiny over the last year. We'll continue to receive a lot of scrutiny between now and when the legislative session ends, and what happens with it, we will see. I'm not sure.
Shawn
Thank you.
Sullivan, Kansas Budget Director.